you so much to the choir, not only for today, but for last night or yesterday afternoon and this afternoon. And I hope sincerely, whether you came yesterday or you missed it, I hope that you'll be here today at 3:30 as they'll be presenting the music and drama called A Christmas Prayer. 2:30 over in the side lobby. Our bell ringers will be over there, and they'll be playing. There'll be some cookies and some apple cider. It'll be a great afternoon. I hope that you'll join us, and maybe if you got a friend or find a friend, make a friend today at lunch and bring them with you today. Again, that starts at 3:30. Now, we lost our dog Flower Pot to cancer back earlier this summer, and Flower Pot was just the best ever. I mean, she really was. She was a better dog than we ever deserved, and just a dream of a pet. And it's interesting. Everything, when I think about her, they're all positive memories. They really are. Like her disposition, her way, and even her name is a pleasant memory to me. Flower Pot. It just seemed to fit her. When we first got her, though, and people found out her name, the assumption was that it was something that our kids came up with because, you know, it kind of sounds dumb. And so I had to explain, no, it wasn't the kids, it was me. Caroline had been talking about the prospect of getting a dog, and for some reason the word flower pot, or the two words flower pot, came across my mind before then. And I always thought that'd be kind of a neat name for a little girl dog. And so when Caroline was saying, how about we get one? I said, if we can name it Flower Pot. And so that's kind of how it worked. But as time unfolded, the name just really, she just kind of grew into it in such a way that it really fit her. It kind of just backed up her disposition. As it relates to the names of animals, though, I really like names for dogs that are unusual, and unusual in one of a couple of ways. I like them to be unusual in the sense that they're not something typically necessarily used for a name. Like, for example, we have entertained the thought maybe of getting another dog at some point in the future, and I really like the name Tater Tot. And so that could be the next name. And so I don't know, but like that's an unusual name. You probably don't know anybody named Tater Tot unless you were part of really a bizarre gang, I suppose. But anyway, so I kind of like that. I like names that are unusual in the sense that they don't necessarily. It's not a common name that somebody else or something else might have. I've always thought it a bit unusual, though, when you have someone that they name like their dog, like Brian or like Heather. It just, that doesn't, I like something a bit more unusual. So like if you've got a Great Dane and you call it Tiny, that kind of fits. That's unusual. If you've got some angry Rottweiler that you name Princess, I kind of like that. So anything that's a bit unusual. And it's not just that I like unusual names. I like how it is that for example, with Flower Pot, she just kind of grew into her name. It just seemed to really fit her. You know, if someone were to ask us if we had a pet, I would say, yeah, we've got a ferocious beast. Her name is Flower Pot. And you can't really be a ferocious beast named Flower Pot, can you? I mean, you just can't. And if you ever got to meet her, if you ever got to know her at all, you know, it just kind of fit her. She was this pretty little sweet little fluff ball. That's who she was. And the name just fit her. The name backed up how she was. We appreciate names that match. We appreciate names and titles that fit. Last week we started a series that I've called What Child Is This? And we're looking, and we've been considering some of the names, some of the titles that were given to Jesus, spoken through the prophet Isaiah 700 years before he ever showed up. And today the title we're going to look at is one where he is described as Mighty God. And the question we want to think about today is, like, in what way does that name fit? How is it that Jesus backs up the name? How is he our mighty God? Look with me in your Bibles today to John chapter 1. As you're turning there, I want to just give you again what is the foundation for this series out of Isaiah 9, verse 6. You don't have to look there. You're probably familiar with it. It's on the screen. For a child will be born for us, a son will be given to us, and the government will be on his shoulders. His name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal or Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. How is he our mighty God? Look in John 1, starting in verse 1. There we are told, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him, and apart from him, not one thing was created that has been created. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. That light shines in darkness, and yet the darkness did not overcome it. And just those few verses, we see the answer to that question: how is Jesus our mighty God? Well, based on what God used John to say, he is a mighty God because he makes everything from nothing. He makes everything from nothing. Now, the first 18 verses in the book or the Gospel of John are known as the prologue to John's Gospel, and they are beautiful words that there's like almost a poetic feel to them. But the truth is, they are swimming in the deep end of the pool, and the theological concepts, the realities that God is using John to communicate about Jesus are not only very essential and very important, they're also not very easy to get our arms around. But we want to unpack it a little bit this morning. In verse 1, we're told that in the beginning was the Word. Probably doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to realize that the reference here, the title, the Word, John's talking about who? He's talking about Jesus. So in the beginning was Jesus. Well, it's interesting as we read this, in the beginning, if you were to look at this verse from a Greek New Testament, the definite article, the, is not there. It literally reads, in beginning was the Word. You say, well, what's the difference? I mean, there's no the, big deal. Well, it actually is of some consequence, because it is communicating the fact that Jesus has always existed. And so whatever your starting point is, if you want to start at any point, Jesus was already there. So if you want to say the beginning of time, at the beginning of time, was Jesus there? Yes. If that's your starting point, if that's the beginning point, this says that Jesus was already there. Well, and ultimately, I would argue that time started when sin came into the world, because you really only need to measure time when you'd have what? A limited amount of it. And before sin came into the world, there was no need to measure time, because everything was going to be operating eternally. So if time beginning is what you want to consider, well, this tells us that Jesus already existed. If you're talking about the created order, everything that we can see and touch, that we can experience, that we can see, all of these things, if that's your starting point, when all of that stuff began to show up, what does this tell us? It tells us that Jesus was already there. Well, how in the world is that actually possible? Well, it's possible because of what you see as the verse continues. That Jesus, the Word, was with God, and then you have this very clear statement: the Word was God. The reason that Jesus is existent whenever the starting point is, that he's already there, is because, as this verse is true, it's telling us that Jesus is God. And God, and I don't quite get this, God doesn't have a beginning. Everything that you and I know has a beginning. I do, you do, your parents did, your grandparents, the pew that you're seated in, this microphone, this carpet, everything that we know has a starting point. But one of the reasons that God is greater than us, that he defies our ability to fully comprehend, is because he's not just like us. He is completely other than us, and as such, he doesn't have a beginning. And any point that you want to start, he was already there. Why is that a big deal? Because we can't lose sight of this as we celebrate Jesus' entrance into the world, that Christmas wasn't when Jesus got his start. Like when we think about the birth of Jesus, we're just thinking about when he took on flesh and blood like we have. It's not like he just kind of showed up and God the Father made him at that point. When we're talking about Jesus, we're not talking about just some plain ordinary baby that was maybe a bit special, a bit unique. We're talking about God the Son coming into the world. And so it is not only that has always existed, but John continues by saying that he was with God in the beginning. In this case, this is a reference to the beginning of everything that we know, everything that we have seen, because verse 3 says, all things were created through him, and apart from him, not one thing was created that has been created. So it says that Jesus was God, and behind all of these statements are some concepts that we have organized into some terms that we don't completely, fully get our arms around. And one of those terms, one of those concepts is the Trinity. And we're talking about the Trinity, we're talking about that there is one God that exists distinctly, eternally distinct in three persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. That God has always existed this way. It's not three gods, it's one God in three persons. You say, I don't get that. Well, I say, we'll take a number. And ultimately, the reason that, especially in Wednesday Bible studies, this is something that I've gone into at some length. One of the reasons that we don't understand it is because of this. Human understanding ultimately is rooted in comparison. That everything that we understand as one thing in relation to another. For example, if someone had never seen a pew before, what would you say? Well, it's kind of like a bench. Some of you say they're good for sleeping. I don't know. So in that instance, you're appealing to something that they may have familiarity with. Somebody says, well, you go to Gate City. Who's the preacher there? It's Michael Owens. What's he like? Well, he kind of, how would you describe him? Like, it looks like a Greek god. Smart like Einstein. Personality like Casanova. Right? That's probably what you would say. And in each of those instances, what are you doing? You're using comparative terminology. You're trying to cause someone to understand what they don't know, what they're not familiar with, based on what they do know. And here's the reality. There is nothing in the whole scope of human experience that is exactly like Trinity. That there is one God in three distinct persons. And try as we might, we can kind of begin to get our arms around it. But there is ultimately a wall that we're going to come up against where we can say, I don't quite get that. I do not fully understand that. That eludes my ability to fully grasp. And hear me in this, because some people think, well, that's just a cop-out, and this is more reason for the skeptic to look skeptically at the Christian faith because of stuff like this, that we can't get it. The reality is this: just because something is not completely understandable by you does not diminish its reality. Does not diminish its truth. Think about all the things that you do not understand. Honestly, I don't get gravity. I really don't. But it is, and it is real. Just because I don't get it doesn't mean that it isn't real. Just because I cannot fully understand that we have God the Father, Son, and the Spirit, one God eternally distinct in three persons that has no beginning, just because I can't get that doesn't mean that it's not true. In fact, ultimately, this ultimately underscores the reason, the foundation for our worship. I worship God because He's greater than me. I'm not worshiping something that is just like me. I'm worshiping something that is completely other than, completely superior to me. And so when we're talking about Jesus and His coming into the world, we're not talking about just an ordinary baby. We're talking about God, God the Son. But Isaiah used another term, though, as he described Him as a mighty God. In what way is He mighty? Again, we're told in verse 3, all things were created through Him. Apart from Him, not one thing was created, that has been created. What is this communicating? Well, it's communicating an important thought that's all based around the word creation. And sometimes we get loose with our terminology and loose with our explanations. And sometimes we fail to communicate properly the reality of this. You and I do not create. There's nothing that you have created. There are things that you have assembled. There are things that you have put together, but you have not created anything. Well, what about Michelangelo or Da Vinci? What about one of those sculptures? What about one of those paintings? Well, if Michelangelo is making a carving out of marble, he didn't make the marble. What did he do with it? He shaped it. He fashioned it. If Da Vinci was painting, what was he doing? He was taking canvas that has been made out of other material, with paint that has been made out of other material, and he's assembling that. He's putting it together. There is no artist, there is no baker, there is no engineer, there is none of us that creates. When you actually create, the Latin phrase is ex nihilo. It means out of nothing. And none of us has the ability out of nothing to create anything. And what we're told here is that Jesus created everything that I know, everything that I'm able to experience, everything that I'm able to observe. He made it. More than made it, He created it. So there was nothing and then there was something. Well, who can do that? Not just God, but a mighty God. Why does that matter? And of what practical import is this? Let me answer it this way. Robbie Brown is the chair of our building and grounds team, and I'm grateful to him and to everybody that's connected as a part of that team. They have saved this church a gazillion dollars with so much work and repair and upkeep and fixing and sprucing up and all kinds of stuff they manage with respect to our facilities, and we owe him and that team a great debt. But Robbie just retired from Duke Power back earlier this year, or I guess about a year ago now, and because of that, he's had a lot more time. He's been doing a fair number of things more around here. And Robbie used to work for Duke Power in substations. So you're talking about really, really high energy, crazy amounts of electricity going into those things. Anyway, so that's what he used to do for years for Duke Energy. Just recently, one of the things that Robbie had done was to go around the hallway out here. The outlets over time, because of vacuum cleaners stretching too far, you know what happens? The outlet gets kind of stretched out. And so you go to plug something in, and it just kind of and so, I mean, this building was built in 97. Those were the original outlets. They can just kind of get worn out. And so Robbie's going around and he's changing these. Now, if I'm doing anything with electricity, I want to make sure, absolutely sure, that any and everything that possibly could be turned off is turned off. I want the power turned off on the other side of Adams Farm if I'm working over here. Right? So that's how I'm working. Robbie is, well, if you can turn the power off, fine. If not, fine. And he'll sit there and work on a hot outlet. I'm like, Robbie, I don't get that. He said, well, you just don't touch the metal parts. Write that in your Bible. Don't, anyway. And so I'm thinking, and I'm not going to do that. And he's like, you know, I've worked in substations for years. I'm working with 35,000 volts. I'm working on that while it's hot. I'm working on that while it's live. I can deal with 35,000 volts. I can deal with 110. What is that? It's an argument from the greater to the lesser. So if I can manage this, I can manage that. Why is it of importance for us to understand when we think about Jesus and his entrance into the world that we're not just talking about an ordinary baby, we're talking about God the Son, our mighty God, because this tells us what? That everything that exists, he made it. Out of what? Out of nothing. Why does that matter? Again, it's an argument from the greater to the lesser. If he can make everything out of nothing, what can he do with you? What can he do with your marriage that's on the rocks? What can he do with your finances where you've made some bad decisions? What can he do with your choices where you've made some lousy decisions that have affected your character and your reputation? What can he do with your past, with the mistakes that you've made? Understand this. If he can make everything out of nothing, my goodness, he can redeem something out of something. And if he can do something with nothing, what can he do with you? What can he do with your problems? Understand, when we're celebrating Jesus coming into the world, Isaiah said it 700 plus years before he ever showed up. We're not just talking about God. We're not just talking about God the Son. We're talking about our mighty God. And how is he our mighty God? Because he makes everything from nothing. This passage tells us one more thing, though, and that's this: that he is stronger than our greatest enemy. He's our mighty God because he's stronger than our greatest enemy. We had up a ton of time dealing with the first point. I'm just cut to the chase with this second. John says in verse 4 that in Jesus, look at that, he says, in him was life, and that life was what? The light of men. He is linking life and light. Linking life and light. And he is also communicating this thought, that light and life are something that have to be brought to us. That we don't produce it, that we don't cause it, that light came into darkness. What is this communicating? Well, the only way that we were able to experience light is because light came into the darkness. Well, what does light do? Well, among other things, light shows us where stuff is, so that we don't step on those Legos, so that we don't run into that chair, so that we don't hit that deer that's off in the distance. Light shows us where things are. It guides us. And We came into this world, we were made, we were created with plan, purpose, intentionality, and into this world, we just showed up. He made us, but unless and until He shows us and reveals to us our plan and purpose, we're just left to kind of figure it out. Why am I here? Oh, I don't know. What's my purpose? Why am I here? I've got no idea. We're operating without guidance, without direction, unless the light comes. But again, He not only is describing Jesus as light, He's describing Him as life. Notice again, He says, in Him was life, and that life was the light of men. That light shines in darkness, and yet this darkness did not overcome it. He's linking light with life, and that means darkness must be associated with what? With death. Consistently, throughout the whole of Scripture, light is always positive. Consistently, throughout the whole of Scripture, darkness is always negative. Light is associated with that which is good and pure and right and associated with God. Darkness is associated with evil, with sin, with separation from God. And so He says we needed light for guidance, but light also is life, and we need life because what? Well, if you're aware of this, but the clock's ticking. You've got a finite amount of time here. You've got a limited amount of time here. Funeral homes are still recession-proof. They just are. The death rate is still 100%. Sooner or later, we have an appointment with the reality of death, and I don't know about you, but I see that as a problem. Hopefully you see that's a problem. And so we need help with this. We don't have the solution on our own, and so He tells us that God the Son, He comes in, and He doesn't just enter the world and have this dramatic entrance, but that He comes so that He could do what? That He could be the light that shines in darkness, that the darkness can't overcome. Well, hopefully you're aware of what happens some chapters later, where Jesus dies on a cross, but then is what? He's resurrected. Life overcomes death. Light overcomes darkness. And who does this? Jesus does. And what does He do? He offers that victory. He offers that victory to those that are willing to lean on and lean into Him as not just their God, but as their mighty God. And we need a mighty God who is mighty because He's stronger than our greatest enemy. I don't know if you've noticed this morning, you probably didn't, but I'm grateful for this. We had, I think, 5 or 6 lights, spotlights that were out. And I was speaking about building grounds earlier yesterday. They got here at 8 o'clock, and they were changing these lights out. And so it was a whole lot of ropes and swinging. No, we actually have a lift. We've got a lift, and I'm grateful for that. But in truth, I have a love-hate relationship with this lift. I'm glad that we have it, but I'm also afraid of it. And so the guys get here, they get this thing set up, and I don't know, it's almost 40 feet, I guess, to the top of the ceiling. And so there's no way to brace yourself with a ladder to get up there. You've got to have this lift. And they get this lift, and it's got some things that where you can even get it up and get it over into pews to get up there. This lift, though, while I'm glad that we have it, if I were buying a lift today, if the choice were up to me, that lift is not the one that I would get. I say that ultimately because of this. There is a sticker on the side of it. I believe it says weight limit is 220 pounds. And those of you skinny people, well, 220, what's the big deal? But for those of us that live in the real world, thinking, did I get egg on that biscuit, or did I would appreciate having a little more wiggle room. And so if I were buying a lift today, I'd find one that says what? Give me something that lifts like 700 pounds. I don't want to get close. I want it bigger than anything I could possibly imagine. Why? Again, this is an argument from the greater to the lesser. If it's greater than the greatest weight that I have, then I know it can hold me. if it's greater than anything I can possibly come up with, then I know it can hold me, that I can depend on it. Listen, if Jesus is stronger than the greatest enemy that people have, and that's the reality of death, what can he do with the people at work that don't like you? How much stronger is he as you are concerned about people that may be reining in on your relationship with your spouse or with your significant other? How much greater is he than what you view as the financial desperation that you are in? Again, it's an argument from the greater to the lesser. If he can make everything out of nothing, and if he can defeat the greatest enemy that you or I or anyone has, it says this: I can trust him, and I can experience him not just as God, but as my mighty God. I ask you very simply today, is he your mighty God? Will you bow your heads with me?